can Israel kill its way to victory? That certainly seems to be the intent and the plan, as the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, has literally refused any opportunity for any sort of diplomatic outcome really since the war began, has rejected every ceasefire that's been offered, both in Hamas in the Gaza Strip and with Lebanon with Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, or with Iran. He doesn't want to talk about any of those things. He just wants to talk about total victory. But here we have actually some additional information today that might impact on all this, and that is Benjamin Netanyahu actually fired his Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant. He wrote, "Unfortunately, although the first months of the war, there was trust and there were very fruitful work, during the last months, the trust is cracked between me and the defense minister. I made many attempts to bridge these gaps," he continued, "but they kept getting wider. They also came to the knowledge that the public in an unacceptable way, and that they came to the knowledge of the enemy. Our enemies enjoyed it and derived a lot of benefit from it." Pretty strong words from Netanyahu. And to try to make sense of this, we have one of the best guests that we have here on this show that talks about things in the Middle East, and that it is Matthew Ho, former State Department official, combat Marine, and presently the Associate Director of the Eisenhower Media Network. Matt, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Danny. Thanks for having me back.
Well, you know, we're going to talk some specific things about the title here, and does Netanyahu want to try to kill his way to victory, and is that even possible? But first of all, I'd like your view on what this happened is with Netanyahu letting his defense minister go. I know there's been talked about in the media a long time, and you texted me earlier that this is actually the second time he's done it. But what do you make of what's going on, and what is really behind it?
I think it's, Danny, a lot of intra-party politics. Gallant is a member of Netanyahu's Likud party. They have a long history together. This is probably tension that goes back a very long time. In March of 2023, excuse me, Netanyahu fired Gallant, who was the defense minister at the time. And this had to do with Gallant's opposition to Netanyahu's judicial reforms. If people remember, before October 7th, the big crisis in Israel was these judicial reforms that Netanyahu was trying to implement that would basically make the judiciary subservient to the Knesset, subservient to the prime minister. A lot of that was the vision of Netanyahu and others in Israel, but also too, it would personally help Netanyahu because he was facing very serious corruption charges. So Gallant had opposed those reforms. Netanyahu fired him, and in a week or two later, he brought him back on. But there's been disagreements between Netanyahu and Gallant throughout this past year of the genocide, throughout this past year of the war with Lebanon and Yemen and Iran. Where Netanyahu has had opposition from his cabinet, it has come from Gallant.
I remember, what is it, two or 3 months back now, Benny Gantz was the first big name really to get to leave the coalition government. And those were all related to a couple of pretty big differences of opinion on how the war should be fought. Do you have any idea if that's the case with Gallant? Do they have any different vision on how the war should be fought?
Well, so Gantz left the war cabinet, which is different, of course, from the actual cabinet. So the war cabinet set up following October 7th, which was a coalition of coalitions, if you will, meant to ensure that the Israeli government is represented by all parties. The governing coalition, separate from the war cabinet, the powers that were in place prior to October 7th, Gallant was a member of that cabinet, of the official cabinet, if you will. That's, of course, as a defense minister. And so over the last year, where you've seen Gallant differ, it's typically been because he's seeing the IDF as being overstretched. They're seeing the IDF as being exhausted. They're seeing the IDF being employed in ways that don't bring about any type of strategic benefit or gain for Israel. The best one I could give you an example of the disagreement between Netanyahu and Gallant was just a few months ago when the issue of the day was the Philadelphia corridor. That's the strip of land between Gaza and Egypt. And at that point, these talks about ceasefire, the drama around ceasefire talks. Of course, we know there was never going to be a ceasefire. The governing coalition, Netanyahu's coalition, was never going to have a ceasefire. But in all the drama, all the public relations drama, the propaganda about a potential ceasefire, there was this disagreement over whether or not we keep Israeli troops stationed in the Philadelphia corridor. And Gallant was the only member of Netanyahu's cabinet to go against it. And it was not because he thought it was unsound or unnecessary, but because essentially the Israeli forces were too extended, that they were too exhausted at that point to continue any type of occupation. I mean, so you've seen those disagreements between Gallant and Netanyahu. I mean, there's other things happening as well. Again, these long personal issues between the two men, inter-party Likud dynamics. But you also had in just today, just hours before this announcement was made, I saw reading on Haaretz that Gallant had put out essentially a message saying the IDF needs to start drafting about 7,000 ultra-Orthodox recruits. This is a big issue in Israel, whether or not the ultra-Orthodox are exempt from the army. So you can imagine a year into this war, a year into this genocide, the overextension, the continual calling up a reservist. You have a segment of the Israeli population that are exempt from being drafted. So big issue in Israel regarding this. Big issue within the Likud party as well. Netanyahu is against calling up these men into the army. Gallant, representing the army, says this is what has to happen. Gallant put out a message today. This is following up on the Supreme Court of Israel saying these people are eligible to be drafted. And so maybe that had something to do. Maybe that was the last straw kind of thing, because a few hours later, he's out. But there's other issues too. I mean, certainly there is this scandal occurring right now. It just erupted over the weekend in Israel, where 4 members of Netanyahu's staff, including his chief spokesperson, has been arrested for revealing classified information to the media. And it just doesn't stop at that. It's just not an issue of leaks. It's an issue of this classified material being manipulated, being falsified, being misattributed to the media in order to try and sabotage ceasefire talks, in order to sabotage hostage talks. If people remember, go back a couple months, there were these reports in the Israeli media that Yahya Sinwar, according to Israeli intelligence, was going to escape to Iran with the hostages, just stuff that just wasn't true. And that was based upon falsified Israeli intelligence. The other report as well, there's another one. One went to a German newspaper, and that was about a supposed report, again, coming from supposedly Yahya Sinwar. It actually came from a junior Hamas person, but the Israeli PM's office attributed it to Sinwar in an attempt to show that there is no possibility of negotiations with Hamas. Hamas is not interested in negotiations that would send the hostages back. So there's no point in going forward with it, right? So a lie, it was misattributed. And so it wasn't just that they leaked this information. They took this classified information, they doctored it up, and then they released it to the Israeli media, attempting to sabotage the ceasefire talks, attempting to sabotage any type of hostage deal. And so that's the very big scandal that's happening in Israel right now. So firing Gallant, all the reasons that Netanyahu has to do that, firing Gallant is a distraction that maybe gets people to turn away from that. And then the timing, Danny, right? I mean, the timing of this, the fact that it occurred on the American election, the day of the American election, does this mean that Netanyahu is clearing the decks, if you will? If Gallant is the one voice of opposition in the cabinet to whatever Netanyahu wants to do, why is Netanyahu making this move on the day of the American elections? What is this signaling? Is he showing that he is basically, after today, going to open up a new phase of warfare in the Middle East? I mean, there's all ways we could speculate on that, but I find that timing to be rather important.
Well, that's a good segue into what I really wanted to talk about on the show primarily today, even before we got this news, because they're directly linked, I think. And that is, does Israel think it can actually kill its way to victory? Now, anytime you talk about using military force, it's to achieve a political outcome. And in the initial phase, after 10/7 of last year, the goal was allegedly to bring peace and stability back to Israel. And so they wanted to, quote, punish the Hamas terrorists. But then they're fighting the seven front war by their own accounting, and they keep escalating it beyond to now that, of course, it even includes Iran to a certain extent. But then the question is, let's narrow down into the Gaza Strip. Let's look at that one first. There's something floating around that's been talking about to some extent in the media about the general's plan. And Gary, if you can toss that one up there, this seems to be the general's plan is attributed to retired Major General Joria Island, former head of national security in Israel, as a strategy to defeat Hamas. It proposes the wholesale transfer of North Gaza's population south beyond the Netzarim corridor. A siege would be imposed on those who remain. And then some of the other people say they want to take the general's plan and then pave the way for more settlers to return into Gaza. And that's I think Ben Gavir in the picture there, who's one of the big advocates of that. Is that something that, number one, is it legit? Is that really what their plan is? And then number two, are they trying to bring it into fruition?
Oh, that is, excuse me, Danny, that is the plan. And just to take a step back even further, you talked about killing as a means to achieve some type of a strategic objective or some type of goal. We have to also remember that for many in Israel, killing is the objective. Killing is the goal. And when you see General Island's plan, this idea of the general's plan, which is also called the surrender or starve plan, you have this understanding that killing is the goal. Ethnic cleansing is the goal. Removing these people one way or another from the land is the goal. So we have to keep that in mind, that we're not dealing, and this is like anything else, whether you're talking about economics, whether you're talking about voting. Very often we want to think of these actors, these people who are doing this, as rational, right? As operating with very clear and identifiable interests in mind. And that's not often the case. In fact, that's probably rarely the case. There's a lot of other factors that are involved in all this. And so this idea of what they're carrying out in the northern part of Gaza, which according to people from all sources, all aspects, both in and out of Gaza, we're seeing the worst days of the last year happening right now, which I know is really hard to believe, particularly for anyone who's been following this every day. But that's what we're hearing from folks in and out of Gaza, is that the worst of the genocide is occurring now. So we're seeing this plan, this general's plan, being carried out in northern Gaza. The idea will be, again, forcibly removed. The Israelis will claim it's a voluntary transfer or voluntary migration. But the idea is that you get these people out and they never can come back. And those who are there are left to die. You can kill them. They can starve to death. I mean, this is one of the things that the Israelis do, is they often issue these evacuation orders or evacuation threats, as I've heard people call them. And the purpose is twofold. One, it's a preemptive, well, I guess threefold, because, as you know, Danny, no military wants to have civilians getting in their way. It just makes everything more difficult. But then the more important points are these type of evacuation orders, evacuation threats are, one, to provide like a preemptive public affairs, preemptive public relations apology for any civilians killed, right? Hey, look, we warned them. We're really sorry this happened, but we did warn them. And then the other side of that is connected with that. The other reason is that you've warned them, and now you're able to engage in a free fire zone. And that's essentially, even though Gaza has been all intents and purposes a free fire zone this last year, what you're really going to see in northern Gaza is a policy that really is kill anything that moves. And we've seen that already to a degree. But I think what you'll see in Gaza, if we can see it, because there'll be such a seclusion on it. They have been targeting journalists very heavily in the last few weeks in northern Gaza. The idea of shutting all the information coming out down is a key component of this. But anyone left in northern Gaza will be put into essentially concentration camps. They will be totally controlled by the Israeli military. Parts of northern Gaza will then be walled off for settlers or for military occupation. I mean, looking at the Israelis right now, I mean, there seem to be two poles for the Israelis in terms of what they're going to do in Gaza. It's either military occupation or full-blown settlement and ethnic cleansing. And somewhere in between, you'll find we'll see what they decide to do, what the Israelis decide to do.
Well, the United States, especially the major media, is never going to use any of those language, any of that language, whether it's the media or government officials, as we'll see shortly. But that's not the case in other parts of the world. So here is a report on exactly what's happening in northern Gaza from France 24.
What the Israelis are trying to do in the northern part of the Gaza Strip is to empty it, basically, to send the citizens who are there, we are talking about 350,000 to 400,000, to the south. It is a straightforward ethnic cleansing.
It's just. I think a great deal of the American population can't get their head around that. They say, no, ethnic cleansing. I mean, that's something that like the Serbs did,
right,
or some of the bad guys in the Middle East. That's not something that Israel, the only democracy and our stalwart ally in the Middle East, how can those things exist, Matt?
Oh, I mean, there's been an effective propaganda campaign for decades to inculcate the U.S. and Europe with a narrative that the Israelis are just like us, that they are the only democracy in the Middle East, as you said, Danny, that they are civilized and their adversaries are barbarians, that this is a struggle of us versus them, of civilization versus barbarism. Those are the words that Netanyahu have used throughout this past year. And those are the words that you hear echoed and parroted by American politicians and by American media. So for decades, you've had this very successful media and information operations campaign by the Israeli government, through all types of lines of effort, whether it be the news media, whether it be through Hollywood, whether it be through our political, where our politicians understand it, where they vote, where they talk about it, so that it becomes the conditioned understanding of what's occurring there is us versus them. So maybe it's subconscious, but when you hear many Americans talk about this, there is an element that this is us, that we are the Israelis. And a lot of that's got to do with race, right? It's white people versus brown people. I mean, as simple as that. But this is also getting into the whole genesis of this colonization of Palestine begun by Britain, after the First World War. This, of course, begins prior to the First World War. The first Zionist Congress is 1897 or something like that, or whatever. And immigration or migration to Palestine had already begun out of Europe. But then people know the Balfour Declaration in 1917. This becomes British policy, and the Brits take control of that part of the world. They have the Palestine Mandate. And then by the 1930s, you just have a very organized and deliberate and high volume immigration of European Jews into Palestine. And the Brits were upfront about what they were doing. The British Governor General of Jerusalem in the 1930s said, our purpose here is to create a loyal Jewish Ulster in the midst of a potentially hostile sea of Arabs. I mean, so this has been the policy. This has been the narrative for, well more than 100 years. And so the idea that the American public and many people in Europe as well continue to think along those lines is not surprising. It's been very successful.
So let me ask you to comment on something here. In light of that report from France 24 I just showed, where he just flat out said there is ethnic cleansing being physically carried out. You have the general's plan being carried out. You may have seen some of the headlines that Gary was putting up while we were talking, where even Blinken is telling Netanyahu, please publicly renounce the general's plan. He won't do it, etc. So we physically see what's going on, what's happening on the ground right now. And in light of all that, this was yesterday, Matt Miller was asked, hey, what about this alleged priority of America to get a ceasefire into the Gaza area? Watch this exchange.
Hamas fighters continue to shoot, continue to target, continue to launch rockets at Israeli forces. So we want to see the end of the war, but it is not a unilateral decision by one of the parties. We want to see the war end in a way that's durable, where you have an agreement of both parties to end the conflict.
Right, but I guess the reason that I'm asking you is because the U.S. is providing much of the weaponry to Israel. So So I am wondering if this particular military strategy, which seems to be imposing a siege, during which the humanitarian aid has dropped significantly, there has been a lot of civilian casualties. Is this military strategy acceptable to the United States, and how long more will you let it continue?
So we have great concerns about the humanitarian toll in northern Gaza. And as to the question of how much longer it will continue, we want to see the war end now. We want to see an end to the war, and that's what we're trying to accomplish.
So she's trying to ask. I mean, you say, it looks like that this is stuff is that they're doing ethnic cleansing. She didn't use that word, but she described what's happening on the ground. And then he says, "Oh, we have great compassion and great concern for the people in Hamas." But with actions, Matt, do we?
Yeah, no, I mean, we've got to be careful, Danny, just to accept these people in Washington D.C. at face value. And if what you're watching and you're watching them and you've seen them act in a way that they are nothing other than the spokespeople for the American policy, there's no reason to think that they're going to differ on it. And they're going to try and church it up, and they're going to try and put lipstick on the pig and all those types of things. But the reality is that this is their policy, that that Israeli genocide is an American genocide, and that people like Matt Miller are going to squirm and disassemble and lie as they can to protect that genocide. And I think we're also seeing some statements now that make it seem clear that they're trying also to protect their legacy or somehow shield their legacy in all of this. But anyone who is not confused by the semantics, by the theater of it, by the excuses put forward by the administration, clearly understands that, look, if you send, and these numbers are dated, these numbers go back to August now, if you send weapons every 12 hours to Israel, if you send 50,000 tons of munitions and weapons and vehicles to Israel as they carry out this genocide, this is your genocide. I mean, we are the chief funder of both the Israeli media, and then Brown University picked up on it and looked at it even further. 73% of the costs of the genocide being carried out by Israel are funded by the United States. So nearly 75% of what it's costing Israel to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians in Gaza is being covered by the Americans. I mean, so we have to be careful, Danny, right? Not to try and look too much farther into what Miller's saying, what Kirby's saying, what Blinken says, or whoever, because we're falling into their trap, right? I mean, so the clearest things are, what are your actions? These are your policies. You're lying to us. That's it.
But so now let's I guess look at that in light of the theme for this show here is, can Israel kill its way to victory? So we've seen what's spent through 13 months now, I guess, and rolling into towards month number 14. And in the Israeli press, they had one of their combat commanders say, "Look, I mean, Hamas has been battered, but they're still quite functional in Gaza." And I've seen some other reports independent of this that say that somewhere around 50% of the pre-war number of fighters could be still active and still alive in there. And of course, as you and I have discussed on several shows, every time that you kill innocent people, all of their male surviving family members are going to be opposed to you. So God only knows what the actual number of people, regardless of what tag you want to put on Hamas or Islamic Jihad or anything else, or just people that are angry at Israel. I mean, they don't seem to be succeeding at killing their way to victory here.
And they won't be. I mean, but again, victory is the killing, right? So just killing these Palestinians are what they're doing. That's the purpose of it. There are all kinds of aspects of what the Israelis are trying to accomplish, including like territorial acquisition, but it also ties into the history of trying to exterminate these people, as well as continuing to carry out, whether it's the biblical commandments, God's commandments, the history, the religious history, the order to vanquish, the enemies of God, just to paraphrase it and put it that way, or the more modern history, carrying on what your grandfather, your fathers, your grandfathers, your great grandfathers have done to claim land, to protect Israel, to take revenge on those who've harmed Israel. I mean, so the killing is just as much the purpose, just for the sake of killing, as it does in terms of actually removing people from the land and taking their territory. So But the idea that in the sense of any military sense or strategic sense, that if you're not successful in that, if you're not successful in completely exterminating the people, then you're going to have this resistance. And
look, by the way,
kill all
you know,
2 million, you're always going to have resistance.
I speaking of that resistance and what maybe the plan is going to be. Now, I put up there a minute ago about the general's plan, which was an Israeli general that was talking about, clearing out, et cetera, and then sending Israeli people back in there. One wonders if there's not also an offshoot of the General Petraeus plan, who seems to be supporting this. It's hard to imagine. Well, maybe it's not hard to imagine, but check out what General Petraeus's great idea is.
In Gaza, you still have substantial remnants of Hamas, of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and then criminal gangs and so forth that are essentially controlling various parts of that territory. And Israel needs to go in because there is no other alternative. Start from the north and work their way to the south and clear and hold, not just clear and leave, which is what they have been doing. Do what we did during the surge, which is you clear and hold, you create gated communities, you come in a mile, let's say, east-west wall, you could throw that up overnight, 12 miles probably at the most. A couple of north-south walls, you create 3 or 4 gated communities, you clear them painstakingly of all enemy. You issue biometric ID cards to those inside that area.
It would be fun if it wasn't sick to be using the phrase gated communities, because that sounds like something exclusive where you have gates and to protect the people inside the gate.
All kinds of amenities, you're going to have pools and
yeah. This sounds more like the creation of a jail cell. How do you see it?
Essentially concentration camps. I mean, this is not any different than what the British did in South Africa 124 years ago. This is how the British attempted to subjugate the South Africans, the Boers. The gall of, I shouldn't even, I mean, he's the creature that he is, General Petraeus. So the cravenness of the media to have him on continually when he's been wrong for so long. And then he cites, because this is the creature he is, he cites the surge in a way that is just disingenuous and incorrect, as if somehow the segregation of Baghdad that the Americans claim as their own didn't occur because of our grand plan and not because we had set forth a violent and destructive and horrible civil war that essentially segregated Baghdad, say, because of that violence. We just happened to put up the walls after the people of Baghdad had already segregated themselves because of that awful, awful civil war that we had instigated. I mean, so the idea, though, that he's talking about is to create concentration camps, to segregate the people, to wall them off, and then these biometric ID cards, probably most likely apps on a telephone, I would imagine. And this way you control the population entirely. You know where they are. You know who they're talking to. You can target them at any time. You can control everything they do. So if these people want bottles of water or they want loaves of bread, they have to follow the commands of the app, so to say. They'll certainly also have the biometric stuff with fingerprints and thumbprints and facial recognition, everything, but it will be very insidious, and it will be built upon the utilization of everything that these powers have learned going back, again, 120 years to the British in South Africa, but that we particularly did, Danny, as you know well, in both Iraq and Afghanistan, these population control, as we called it, this idea of trying to, and this goes into counterinsurgency theory, which I think many people will agree with us that it's complete garbage. But, it's based on some good work and some things that, like Mao had to say about this, in the sense that an insurgent is, like a fish. An insurgent moves through the population like a fish moves through water. The idea then for crackpots like Petraeus is that if we can take the fish out of water, if we can take the insurgent out of the population, the insurgents will die off. And you just can't, because the idea is that the insurgency is not the sum and total of individual people. The insurgency is the sum and total of the resistance to your occupation. And so unless you exterminate the entire population, because we're not even talking about subjugation, we're talking about extermination to achieve the results that they're talking about. If you persist in occupation, then without achieving that goal of complete cleansing, then you have to subjugate the population. And that has to be as brutal as the Romans would have done it, 2,000 years ago. But Petraeus and others, these men who their own failures at war should be enough to discredit them, but they are now representing banks and oil companies. They sit on the boards of all types of corporations. They teach at universities, and they go on the media, and they still sell this snake oil about counterinsurgency when there is no way to victory in this type of occupation. There's
And
only
look, you also have
subjugation
to
or
take in mind,
negotiation.
the other thing about that that just really gets my gall is the perversion of even the imperfect counterinsurgency plans. That was to protect the population. Some of the things that we're supposed to do here. This is, as you say, the reverse of that, to subjugate the population. That's why it's perverted even bit that. And that
Right. If you take, say we take the Baghdad example, that was an attempt, the population already segregated themselves. The Shia and Sunni had already separated. Baghdad had been a mixed city. The Shia and Sunni have really segregated themselves by the time Petraeus takes command in December of 06 or January of 07 or whenever it was. And then they put the walls in and everything else and make that segregation official. But even then, the idea behind it was to protect the population, to protect the Sunnis from killing the Shia and the Shia from killing the Sunnis. But what we're seeing here, Dan, exactly as like you said, it's about subjugating the population, about controlling them. And the idea being this will be very dystopian. It will be very science fiction-esque. It'll be like an episode of Black Mirror, if people are familiar with that television show. The idea being that it will be us, because there's already Dan Cohen from Uncaptured Media has done a lot of reporting on this. This will be run by Israeli companies, American companies. There will be American contractors and Israeli contractors or mercenaries involved. And lots of people will make a lot of money off of this, essentially setting up concentration camps, which they will call gated communities in some type of sadistic euphemism. The problem will be is that the resistance will only strengthen, not just continue, but will strengthen the longer the occupation goes on for. I mean, this idea that a year later and you're sitting around, like what basically Petraeus is saying, the reason why Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and this resistance to the Israelis still continues is because the Israelis didn't do it right. They're not doing it the correct way.
Right.
They're not doing it good enough. If they just did it, if I was in charge, they would have won this stuff. It would, it's just the whole, the inability for these people even to accept, not just the reality of the current situation, but historic reality. I mean, again, these are the problems the Romans faced. These are the problems the Romans faced. This is, I don't know my Roman history that well, but I mean, this is essentially, I think it was Marcus Aurelius, and people please in the comments correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it was Marcus Aurelius who pulled the legions out of Germany. Because of this problem, we're never going to win here. This is futile. All we're doing is just fighting generation after generation. I remember being in Afghanistan, Danny. I've probably said this to you before. And there was a sergeant who was there. He was like on his third deployment to Afghanistan. And he said to me, you know what? He's like, we got to just start shooting the 12-year-olds, and the meaning that because when I come back 2 years from now, 3 years from now, however long, those 12-year-olds are going to be 15, 16, 17-year-olds old, and they're going to be fighting us. So we might as well just shoot them now. He wasn't advocating for child murder or anything like that, but he just recognized the insipidness, the futility, the stupidity of our occupation.
Indeed, it turned out to be that way.
Right.
But this is the issue going on here. If we were only talking about the Gaza Strip, it certainly, I think you can make a pretty strong case that it is an unwinnable war, that there's no amount of bombs and no amount of Israeli defense forces is ever going to solve that problem, short of the physical wiping out of all 2 million of the people. Now, I used to say that like that's even that's beyond the pale. I don't know that I can say that with as much confidence anymore. But we're not just talking about Gaza Strip. Also, here is Yoav Gallant before he got fired. A couple weeks back, he was in Lebanon talking about how they've now added a new target list.
רואים ממש פרוס לפנינו את כל קו הכפרים הראשון של חיזבאללה. מה שמאפיין את המקומות האלה זה שכל אחד ואחד מהם זה יעד צבאי ומוצב תת-קרקעי עם הרבה מאוד מנהרות, עם אמצעי אמל"ח. מצאו פה מאות RPGים, מקלעים, טילי נ"ט, ואת כל הדברים האלה צה"ל משמיד עכשיו, יעד אחר יעד, מתחת לאדמה ומעל לאדמה. כל מקום כזה, לא רק שיושמד, אלא שלא נאפשר את חזרתם של המחבלים אל תוך המקומות האלה. זה הדבר חיוני על מנת לשמור את ביטחונם של תושבי הצפון.
So, I mean, now that you're talking now, we're into, they're in a full-on invasion into Lebanon. And Gary, if you could throw that map up, we had Alex of History Legends on talking about this a couple of days back, and you see that after a full month of war, that light blue area there north of the border, that's as far as the IDF has gotten, and at the cost of potentially up to 400 wounded in action and 42 or 82, depending on how you count things, killed in action so far, on top of everything that continues to go on in the Gaza Strip. How can the IDF continue now to add Hezbollah in southern Lebanon to the target list?
And just to be clear, Danny, on that map, the light blue line was the limit of their advance. It's not what they're actually occupying, right? Like they're not occupying in that total. They're not occupying that area. It's just that line represents the farthest Israeli troops.
That is correct. Yes, that is correct.
Exactly. They're not. They haven't garrisoned it. There's no outposts throughout the whole thing. Just so people are clear. Yeah. It was a political move. Certainly taking on Hezbollah. You can imagine the operational strategic decisions for that. If you are up against the axis of resistance. The idea being, of course, to take on the axis of resistance, the seven-front war, as the Israelis describe it, take them on one at a time. Don't take on the whole fist, right? Take on one finger at a time. It's much easier. Pretty basic stuff. But then you start looking at and that's, of course, juxtaposed against, well, you could also just stop your genocide and actually start negotiating and preclude all of this. But there's the main thing is the political benefits that come from this war in Lebanon. I mean, expanding into Lebanon has been a fantasy, a dream for many in the Israeli establishment, military, political, whoever, whether they're secular nationalists, militarists who want to have a buffer zone, who feel that, okay, third time's a charm. We didn't win in 82 to 2000. We didn't win in 2006. This time we can get it right. And then of course the religious right wing who believe that this is part of greater Israel and this is our responsibility to do it. There's also the political benefits, right? I mean, the benefit to Netanyahu and his government coalition from fighting Hezbollah, a huge boogeyman, Nassan Nasrallah, the former head of Hezbollah, along with the Ayatollah, one of the two biggest boogeymen for the Israeli people, even bigger than, say, Yahya Sinwar as Mahania was for the Israeli people. So the fact that Netanyahu was able to kill Nasrallah, we saw he got a bump in his polling numbers because of it. So the political benefits. And then there's this other idea of, as what Gallant was getting to, we're destroying these bunkers and we're destroying Hezbollah positions so that our people can move back to their homes in northern Israel. Well, what the Israelis did in the summer, the governing coalition did, was they made getting those people back into their homes in northern Israel a goal of the war. So their goal was to destroy Hamas, a goal was to get the hostages home, and it was to now this other goal of getting these people back into their homes. And it's an easy metric, right, Danny? Either these people are back in their homes or they're still in hotels in Tel Aviv and Haifa or wherever they're at. So it's very easy to see, was it accomplished or not? So as long as these people aren't back in their homes, the war can continue and the political benefits can be accrued. This gets back to some of the differences between, or the difficulties between Gallant and Netanyahu. Gallant didn't want the IDF to be overstretched. Certainly he's okay with the war in Lebanon. He just felt it should have been done in a wiser, more rational, maybe slower manner. When his disagreement with Netanyahu over the Philadelphia corridor was, look, pull our guys out because they need to be pulled back. We can always put them back in later. That it was that type of no, this is strategically unsound. We're not going to get any benefit from it. It was simply like, look, the army is exhausted. I agree with killing Palestinians. I agree with killing Lebanese, but we've got to do it in a more practical, sounder, more efficient manner for us. That video there shows that this idea, similar to the idea in Gaza, is that we're going to cleanse the area. We're going to cleanse southern Lebanon of these evildoers. right? And that's going to make it safe for our people to return home. I don't know how they think they're going to do that. I think essentially they want to get to the point where southern Lebanon is a free fire zone, where it's lightly garrisoned, but primarily just a free fire zone for their drones and attack aircraft. And it's uninhabitable for the Lebanese, so that nobody is south of the Litani River. But as you know, that doesn't, what does that do to accomplish any type of buffer zone to stop Hezbollah attacks on northern Israel or even central Israel? Because most of Hezbollah's munitions, with the exceptions of their lower end, rockets, have ranges that far exceed that buffer zone.
Yeah.
So it is. You look at it and you say, well, what's going to come of this? Say you do that. Say you chase everybody north of the Litani River and you've garrisoned it and it's quiet and none of your troops are getting killed. They're still just going to shoot rockets from north of the river. They're still going to shoot missiles and drones from north of the river.
Right. Yeah. And that would come at an extremely high cost to get there anyway. And that's not all. Gary, we're able to find that one by Bennett. No, you couldn't find it. The Naftali Bennett has several times in recent weeks come on and said that, the fight in Hamas, the fight and against Hezbollah, that's not enough. We also need to go after Iran. This is a once in a 50-year opportunity. I mean, he was literally gleeful with it. So you have already just painted out how hard the Gaza Strip is, and it's unwinnable militarily so far. Now then, they've taken on another and even bigger in southern Lebanon. That's even more militarily unattainable. And now then, they want to go into Iran, and we're still, as of this moment, we're still waiting on a reported response from the Iranians to the south. And now, of course, Israel's already planning what they would do in response. How can Israel keep trying to win and kill its way to victory in all these places, and all they do is dig themselves a deeper hole?
And they're losing sight of their priorities. By doing this, they're jeopardizing their aims, right? Because for the Israelis, Danny, right, their prime focus, their priority, the number one concern for the Israelis is and always has been and will be the Palestinians. Until they're rid of the Palestinian problem, however they go about that, that's their priority. Everything else, Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and including Iran, is not their priority. The biggest adversary for the Israelis by far, disregard the rhetoric, it's the Palestinians. It always comes back to, that's what it's about. The Israeli animus with the Iranians is about Palestine. That's what it's about. And so if the Israelis get too far into this and they can no longer concentrate on the Palestinian problem, then they're hurting themselves in trying to achieve their own aims. Iran for the Israelis, of course, is a problem. The Palestinians receive support from Iran, just as the Lebanese do, just as the Syrians and the Iraqis do, and the Yemenis do. But I mean, certainly this idea, though, of going fully into a war with Iran would be a huge mistake for Israel. I mean, at best, what's going to happen? At best, you destroy a whole bunch of Iranian military capabilities. You hurt their economy. You kill their supreme leader, right? What comes of that, though? What comes of it? They'll elect a new supreme leader, and he'll probably be worse than the guy you had before, right? They'll rebuild their economy. At the same time, too, the rest of the world is suffering from a terrible economic collapse because Iran has shut down the Straits of Hormuz, et cetera, et cetera. Oil's $200 a barrel, that type of thing. Great, terrific. You did that, and the Russians, and now you'll probably get the Chinese selling them military equipment or maybe even giving it to them, right? So there's what are you going to get out of that? But the thing about Iran for the Israelis is it distracts the Americans. The Israeli need for the Americans to see Iran as the big problem. The Israeli need for the Americans to see Iran as the chief enemy of our best friend Israel is paramount. It's very important for them. And the thing about the Iranians is this works so well for the Israelis because for 40 years, more than 40 years, right, we've had this storyline, this narrative in the U.S. that the Iranians have American blood on their hands. Right. So, I mean, you have Kamala Harris, maybe she'll be president tomorrow. Who knows? Who says that, Iran is our major adversary in the world. I mean, right. I mean, so that works very well for the Israelis to distract people from the issue of Palestine make it be all about the Iranian evildoers, Iran being the bad guy in the region, the cause of all the problems. And the other thing too, it's the hook that keeps America fully involved on this. I mean, whenever you hear American politicians talk about supporting Israel, it's because of Iran, because of the mullahs or blah, 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 blah. You know, I mean, so yeah, I mean, but for get back to this idea of Israel escalating and provoking something with Iran, it just doesn't, it's just not wise, you know. But then again, now I'm falling in the trap I was warning about of, like, you know, speaking about the Israelis as if they're rational, as if they're just coldly looking at this through lens of rational, pragmatic decision making, and not because half of them really truly believe that a magical real estate agent in the sky gave them all that land, and it's their duty to kill all the other people on the land. You know, I mean, that's how literally half of that cabinet in Tel Aviv sees this, and the other half isn't that far removed from it. So when we start talking about rational, pragmatic decision making, it really isn't there.
Well, and I want to put this in context. So everything that we've talked about over the last 45 minutes paints a very clear picture that militarily, there is no military solution in the Gaza Strip that's going to work. Anything that they're doing is not going to bring peace to the Israeli people. It's just going to get more people killed, and it's going to keep the resistance going on. Mm-hmm. Same with the Lebanese, southern Lebanon, where the Hezbollah, and of course, now then you're on the brink of something potentially bigger in Iran. On top of all of that, in fact, including all of that, and Gary, if you can play these two Netanyahus back to back. First of all, here was Netanyahu talking about his total victory to the U.S. Congress and then to the UN General Assembly. Watch these two.
Until we destroy Hamas's military capabilities, end its rule in Gaza, and bring all our hostages home. That's what total victory means, and we will settle for nothing less. Far from being lambs led to the slaughter, Israel's soldiers have fought back with incredible courage and with heroic sacrifice. And I have another message for this assembly and for the world outside this hall. We are winning.
That last part was maybe the worst of all, because you have just painted a disastrous picture for the people of Israel, that they have committed themselves to something that they can't realize. And he calls it winning.
Yeah, I think this is the Israelis. You know, if I try and be impartial and objective about this, the Israelis have a path forward where they can realize some of their objectives. You know, particularly if they play everything correctly with the Americans and not do too much, like not expect too much, and certainly not provoke a major regional war with Iran. But right now, they're going to get everything they want from the American administration. Including, you know, annexation of the West Bank. I mean, certainly they can go ahead and annex the West Bank. The Trump administration is all for it. A Harris administration, they might politely disagree, but they're not going to do anything about it. So if they continue to focus on what their priorities are now and not let themselves get too ambitious, get too greedy, to get to, you know, Naftali Bennett's, this is our once in 50-year chance to do it all, right? If they have just focused on what they need to focus on, they have a path forward for in a couple of years to have realized these ambitions of expanding greater Israel into Gaza and fully into the West Bank. You know, but they have to back off of their commitment in Lebanon. They have to back off of their desire to have this violence with Iran for the sake of, you know, just continuing the blood cycle, continuing the bloodlust. But, you know, there is, you know, so you could see a path forward for the Israelis here. But again, that's if they're practical, if they're cold, if they're objective about it, they're rational about it, which they're not. You know, I mean, the whole purpose, the whole idea of what they're doing is based upon a religious story from 2,500 years ago or so that God gave them this land. I mean, so as long as that's what they actually is the basis of why they're carrying out this war, this genocide, why have they carried out this ethnic cleansing and colonization for the last 120 years, then we can't expect them to be rational and mature and smart about what they're going to do. And, you know, I mean, they're sacrificing so much already. They're exhausting their reserve army. They're exhausting their economy. They're isolating themselves from the world. They think that's all well and good because as long as the Americans are with us, the whole world can be against us. And there's some truth in that. And I don't see that changing in terms of the Americans abandoning them for, I couldn't even begin to predict when that might change.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we'll have to wait and see how that's going to play out. I can only see a bad outcome. I can't see any possible good outcome. But a lot of that's going to depend, at least in the direction or maybe the speed with which that goes, depending on what happens here in the United States today. And in the last bit of time we have here, I would like your view on what it means in terms of foreign policy if either Harris wins or if Trump wins. So let's start with Harris first. If Harris wins the election and she becomes president of the United States, what change will that have? And I want you to look at two things. First of all, with the Middle East, and second, with the Russia-Ukraine war.
With Middle East, I don't think there's any change from the Biden administration. Again, even you could have the Israelis annex the West Bank, and the Harris administration will disagree, and they'll make some statements, and they may say they're going to hold money back or something, but nothing will fundamentally change. They can't. I mean, it does. If the Holy Mother came to Kamala Harris and said, you need to end this with Israel, and she did, the Congress would impeach her the next day. I mean, so the Israelis have such control of the American political system with regards to the Middle East that they're going to get what they want. With regards to Russia, maybe things might be different, though. There may be a break between the Harris campaign and the Biden White House on Russia. That's not what we saw in her commentary over the last months. She's been very hawkish on it. I haven't seen anything coming from the campaign that says, like, we're going to reverse course on this, we're going to seek negotiations, et cetera, because that would, of course, be completely contradictory to the whole Democratic identity of the U.S. is for democracy, the Republicans are for autocracy and dictatorship in Russia. Vladimir Putin equals Donald Trump, right? So, but some of the other factors we're seeing, there was that New York Times article this weekend where they actually, the New York Times said that the war is no longer stalemated, that Russia's winning. That right, American intelligence is saying that Ukraine can only hold out for 6 months to 12 months longer. So all those kind of behind the scenes voices whispering, all that stuff is surfacing, and so it's possible we might see a Harris administration change on the Ukraine-Russia policies of the Biden administration in a way that we're not expecting to. At the same time, too, I can see the Harris administration continuing with the Biden policy on Ukraine, particularly based upon who she brings in and how. Yeah. Right? I mean, some of the people that she's willing to bring. That if you get Michelle Flournoy in as the Secretary of Defense, Flournoy, who is the policy director for the Pentagon, right, for Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, the coup in Ukraine, all these different things. This is not a person who deals well with reality.
She's one I specifically called out in 2012 when I called out the lies of both the U.S. generals and the U.S. policymakers. Her and Petraeus were the twin bad ones. So
yeah. So if you have those types of people brought in who just refuse to accept reality, then I think the policy continues as it is.
And so on the other side of this, if Trump is elected, I think it was on Joe Rogan the other day, maybe on one of the other channels, I can't recall, but Trump was specifically asked, who would your national security and foreign policy people be if you came in? And he said, well, he's thinking about either Mike Waltz, Mike Pompeo again, or Tom Cotton as state or Secretary of Defense. If Trump wins, almost regardless of what he might think, if those are the people that he's putting in at the top spots, what does that tell you about where the foreign policy of the U.S. would go in both Iran, Israel, and in the Ukraine-Russia war?
It'd be well, certainly the Middle East policy would be the most would be about the most supportive of Israel that we've seen, probably, that we've ever seen, even.
That's saying something.
That's saying a lot, right? I mean, but like certainly the Israelis could do what they wanted as they wanted. But that's not many more. That's not many degrees or orders of magnitude more than what a Harris administration. So this whole idea that somehow it's going to be much of a difference for the Palestinian people, I don't think so. Not. Just going to look uglier. It's going to be more uncouth in a Republican administration. It's going to just be not as polished as a Democratic administration would be. With Russia, Ukraine, certainly I could see, Cotton. I think Waltz has been very hawkish on Russia. So has, of course, Pompeo over time. But these are all people who will change their tune if that's what Trump wants, particularly if he dangles China in front of them. I think, these are men who, right, if they're given the option of like, should we continue to spend a couple $100 billion killing Russians, or should we have this money and give it to the Taiwanese so they can kill Chinese? They will say, let's kill a Chinese. So these are all very dangerous people. This will be this type of cabinet will be incredibly dangerous. I shouldn't even try and find any other word than that. And then the important thing is, Danny, is the people who get staffed underneath. Where are they going to come out of? Who are these people? Well, there'll be people who are already in the Trump administration. There'll be people who are in the Bush administration. So it's going to be the people who've been biding their time at AEI, at Heritage, at the Institute for Study of War, at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Or you're going to see the most extreme of the big mouth talks in Washington, D.C., getting them put into positions. So I think you have a foreign policy that is again, degrees worse than a Harris foreign policy would be. But, at the end of the day, how much worse is it type of thing? I mean, you do have there is this possibility with Trump, because he talked about Trump saying we're going to end this thing with Russia. At the same time, too, I could see Trump coming into office and not doing that, because he's Trump.
Yeah. So bottom line is it probably is not going to make a whole lot of difference for any of these, depending on who. I think you're right. It may be degrees of differences in either one, but I don't see any fundamental shifts coming, other than the potential for Trump making good on his claim to cease support for the Ukraine-Russia war. That could be. So I would certainly hope that would be the case.
That could be, but there's still a tremendous amount of support in Congress for it, right? I mean, the votes in Congress and the House are about 300 to 100, roughly, right? In the sense of even more lopsided in the Senate in terms of support for Ukraine. So he's got essentially, when the last appropriation went through in April, it's the $60 billion to Ukraine. Every Democrat in both the House and the Senate voted for him, and about half of the Republicans did. Right. So this might be a battle he doesn't want to take on, or it might be a battle he doesn't win. And certainly the weapons companies and the banks who've been promised so much money in all of this. Right. I mean, who've been promised so much. I mean, the weapons companies have tens and tens of billions of dollars in outstanding contracts for the next several years for Ukraine. They're going to give that up. And the same with the banks who have been promised the reconstruction of Ukraine at whatever cost that's going to be. Right. They're going to give that up. So imagine whatever would occur, negotiate would have to placate those interests.
What's really heartbreaking is that none of the things you mentioned there did the people of Ukraine ever enter the conversation.
Oh, no, absolutely no.
And I think you're 100% accurate. And that's
no. I mean, the Ukrainian people. I mean, it's a really, and same on the Russian side. I don't see the Russians' options here. I mean, because even if what's the best case for Russia now? It's having to occupy land they didn't want to occupy in the first place, right? And dealing with that. I mean, that's best case for Russia right now, because they're not going to get, when Russia enters into Ukraine in 22, the idea is to force basically adherence to the Minsk agreements. And they want to autonomize part of Eastern Ukraine. They don't want to garrison Eastern Ukraine. And now they have to do that. And they've accepted that, and they will do it. But now, say this collapse happens on the front and the Ukrainian army collapses and Russia pushes forward. Now they're moving into more oblasts, right? They're moving further west. And now
people are more opposed to them as well.
Yeah, they don't want that. Why would they want that? As well as the fact that Ukraine does collapse, great. You've got Syria there now. You've got Afghanistan there now. I mean, that's not good for anybody. And in all of this, as you said, it's the Ukrainian people who suffer.
Yeah. Well, we'll wait and see. The most of the rest of the world is sitting there waiting to find out what's going to happen with the election returns, which will start coming in not just hours from now.
Yeah.
And we'll be watching with everybody else. But as always, Matt, thanks for coming on today and sharing your views on this. So at least we have a very firm grasp of what's really going on.
All right. Thanks, Denny.
And thank you all. To appreciate you. We will see you certainly on the next episode of the Daniel Davis Deep Dive. Also, for those of you who are interested, I will be on later tonight with Doug McGregor on his show on the Our Country, Our Choice. They're going to be doing an election results show for most of the evening. I think it's OCOC.com. I will be appearing there along with quite a few other people. Should be very entertaining. So tune in there if you'd like to know about how the results are going on and what's going on. Otherwise, we'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.